We descend into the shadows of history, not to the battlefields or the grand forums where empires are forged, but to a quiet, gilded room where one of the most twisted love stories ever recorded began. There are stories that historians tell, and stories they whisper. A tale so profoundly disturbing that it feels like a fever dream, a story that peels back the veneer of power to reveal the madness festering beneath. It challenges our understanding of grief, identity, and the corrupting nature of absolute control. Imagine the most powerful man on earth, an emperor worshipped as a god, losing the woman he worships. And in the vortex of his grief, he doesn't just mourn, he decides to defy death itself. He decides to create a new wife by finding a young boy who bore a haunting resemblance to her and, through an act of horrific, transforming him into her living image. This is not a dark fantasy concocted to slander a long-dead ruler. This happened in the heart of the Roman Empire, under the reign of Emperor Nero, whose name was Sporus, was not merely a plaything, dressed in the dead empress's gowns, and married to Nero in a lavish public ceremony. He was given the title of Empress, the Augusta of Rome, and forced to live this waking nightmare for years. And the most chilling detail, a detail that whispers to us across 2 millennia, is that some historians believe Sporus may have become a willing participant in his own destruction, a testament to the terrifying power of psychological conditioning. Before we pull back the curtain on this tragedy, I invite you to join our community. If you're the kind of person who finds truth in the darkest corners of the past, who believes that history's most uncomfortable stories are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves, then this is a place for you. If you feel that familiar chill, that pull of morbid curiosity, let it guide your hand to the subscribe button and give this video a like. Where are you joining me from tonight? Are you tucked away in a quiet corner of your home, with only the screen for light? Let me know in the comments. I love knowing who I'm sharing these quiet hours with. Now, let the world outside fade away. We're stepping back in time, into a story that shatters every boundary of love, power, and human obsession. The Gilded Cage. When we think of ancient Rome, we conjure images of splendor and strength. The soaring arches of the Colosseum, legions marching in perfect synchrony, and senators in purple-bordered togas debating the fate of the known world. The year is 67 AD, and the Roman Empire is a titan astride the globe. It stretches from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Africa, its domain encompassing a quarter of the world's population. Grain and exotic spices flood the capital, funding architectural marvels that still defy the imagination. To the citizens of Rome, their empire must have seemed eternal, a civilization blessed by the gods, the pinnacle of human achievement. But within the heart of this magnificent empire, inside the sprawling, opulent palace on Palatine Hill, a sickness was festering. Psychological rot was consuming the man at its center, the same Nero who famously and falsely was said to have fiddled while Rome burned. The truth is far more complex and far more terrifying. He was about to commit an act so fundamentally warped that it would be whispered about in horror for centuries to come. To truly grasp the gravity of this, you must understand the Roman psyche. This was not a society that shied away from brutality. They were connoisseurs of violence. Citizens flocked to gladiator games to watch men be torn limb from limb by wild beasts for entertainment. Slavery was the bedrock of their economy, with wealthy families owning hundreds of human beings as property. Crucifixion was a common form of public execution, a gruesome warning to any who dared defy Roman authority. By their standards, very few acts were considered truly taboo. So when I tell you that what Nero did to Sporus shocked even the Romans, a people desensitized to nearly every imaginable form of depravity, you begin to understand the monumental scale of this horror. This wasn't a fleeting impulse, a momentary lapse into madness. It was a calculated, methodical, and meticulously planned project, carried out by the most powerful individual on the planet. And it all began with a feeling we can all, in our darkest moments, relate to: the devastating inability to let go of a lost love. Nero had been married to a woman named Poppaea Sabina, and by every historical account, he wasn't just in love with her, he was pathologically obsessed. She was his sun, his moon, his entire universe. Roman historians describe her as a woman of staggering beauty, with shimmering golden hair that she famously maintained with a daily wash of donkey milk and crushed pearls, a beauty routine that cost more than the average Roman family earned in a decade. Poppaea was far more than a pretty face. She was a master of manipulation, a cunning political operator who had the Emperor of Rome wrapped around her little finger. She wielded her influence with surgical precision, isolating Nero from his old advisors, like the philosopher Seneca, making him dependent solely on her counsel. She convinced him to murder his own mother She orchestrated the exile and eventual execution of his first wife, Octavia. This woman held absolute sway over the most powerful man in history. And then in 65 AD, Poppaea died. The exact circumstances are debated, but the most widely accepted and chilling account, reported by the historian Tacitus, is that Nero himself killed her. In a fit of rage during an argument, he either kicked her violently in the stomach while she was, in some versions, shoved her down a flight of marble stairs. Imagine the psychological abyss that opens in the mind of a man who realizes he has just murdered the one person he believed he could not live without. Imagine that man is not just any man, but an emperor with limitless power, infinite resources, and a well-documented history of bending reality to his will through brute force. Most people experience grief in stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. But what happens when you're the Emperor of Rome, and the word acceptance is simply not in your vocabulary? What happens when you believe you have the power to command armies, reshape cities, and declare yourself a god? You decide that even death will not be allowed to stand in your way. Nero did not grieve Poppaea. He had her body embalmed with priceless spices rather than cremated in the Roman tradition, and he delivered a eulogy at her state funeral, where he deified her, declaring her a goddess. In the weeks that followed, the palace became a shrine to his madness. He would spend hours in her empty chambers, speaking to the air as if she were still there, becoming enraged when servants accidentally moved a piece of her jewelry or a misplaced robe. In the mind of an emperor, a refusal to accept reality can lead to the most horrifying of destinations. The search for a replacement began almost immediately after her lavish funeral. Nero's agents fanned out across the empire, from the bustling markets of Rome to the quietest provincial towns. They weren't looking for a new wife. They were looking for a specific raw material. They were looking for a young person who bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead empress. Not a passing similarity, but someone who, with the right modifications, could become her. It was in those modifications that a story of grief twisted into a saga of madness, a window into soul and empire that was beginning to rot from the inside out, the making of a monster. To understand a man who would mutilate a boy in the name of love, we have to understand the boy he once was. Because the most unsettling fact about Nero is that he didn't start as a monster. For the first 5 years of his reign, a period historians call the Quinquennium Neronis, he was hailed as one of Rome's most enlightened and promising rulers. Terrifying illustration of how absolute power doesn't corrupt instantly. It's a slow-acting poison that seeps into the soul, drop by corrosive drop. Picture a baby born on December 15th in the coastal town of Antium, originally named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, was destined to rule the world. But his family tree was a tangled, poison mess. His great-great-grandfather was Mark Antony, of Antony and Cleopatra fame. Agrippina the Younger was the sister of the depraved Emperor Caligula, a woman whose ambition was so ruthless it would make Lady Macbeth blush. When Nero was just 3, his father died, and his uncle seized a family fortune and exiled his mother. The boy lost his father, his home, and his mother. The early trauma was profound. For the next few years, little Nero was raised by his aunt, living a relatively quiet life. But even then, there were whispers, dark omens. His aunt recalled that he had an unusual fascination with the gladiator games. While other boys cheered for the warriors, Nero seemed transfixed by the moment of death itself, the final spasm of life leaving a body. Nero was 11. His life was upended once more. The new emperor, Claudius, married his mother, making her the most powerful woman in Rome. And Agrippina had a plan. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, pushing aside Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus, to make Nero the heir to the throne. Imagine that psychological vertigo. In 12 short months, Nero went from being a dispossessed child to future emperor of the known world. We have a modern term, sudden wealth syndrome, that describes the psychological disorientation people feel when they come into a massive, unexpected fortune. Most lottery winners lose it all within a few years because they can't handle the change. But what happens when you are given not sudden wealth, but sudden, absolute power over 60 million people? Nero's education was entrusted to one of the greatest minds of the era, the Stoic philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca. The irony is almost too much to bear. One of history's greatest teachers of self-control, virtue, and the dangers of unchecked power was personally tutoring one of its most infamous tyrants. And for a time, it seemed to work. Nero showed immense promise, studied music and architecture, and even expressed discomfort with the brutality of the gladiator games. might have its first philosopher king. When Claudius died in 54 AD, almost certainly poisoned by Agrippina, the 16-year-old Nero became the youngest emperor in Roman history, and his first 5 years were golden. He lowered taxes, reduced bureaucracy, and promoted the arts. Ordinary citizens felt, for the first time in decades, that their emperor genuinely cared for their well-being. But around 59 AD, the poison began to work. The change was subtle at first. He began demanding applause for his artistic performances. He started roaming the streets at night in disguise, picking fights with strangers for the thrill of it. Then came the moment that ripped the mask off forever. His relationship with his mother, Agrippina, the architect of his power, began to sour. She tried to reassert her control, to remind him of his debt to her. But Nero was no longer a boy she could manipulate. In his emerging narcissistic worldview, his mother was a living reminder that his power wasn't entirely his own. She was a threat to his sense of absolute autonomy. And for someone like Nero, that was intolerable. In 59 AD, Nero decided to murder his own mother. This was not a crime of passion. It was a cold, methodically planned assassination. His first attempt was darkly theatrical. He commissioned a special collapsible boat designed to sink and drown her in the Bay of Naples. When Agrippina, an excellent swimmer, survived, Nero sent assassins to finish the job. She reportedly pointed to her womb and cried, "Strike here! For this bore Nero." Nero showed no remorse. It was as if killing the woman who gave him life had unlocked something primal and monstrous within him. Just a few years later, would fall under the spell of Poppaea Sabina. This was the mind that, when faced with losing her, would decide not to grieve, but to recreate. The hunt for a ghost. The search for the boy who would become Sporus began with chilling, bureaucratic efficiency in the spring of 66 AD. This was not the frenzied act of a madman, but a state-sponsored project, a campaign of human trafficking with the full resources of the Roman Empire behind it. Nero's instructions to his agents were disturbingly precise. He wasn't looking for a vague resemblance to Poppaea. He had a detailed checklist. He needed a boy between the ages of 12 and 16, young enough to be physically and psychologically malleable, yet old enough to survive the horrific procedures he had planned. The candidate needed to have naturally fair hair, a slender build, and facial bone structure that mirrored the dead empress. But the criteria went beyond the physical. Nero specified personality traits. He sought someone quiet, compliant, and eager to please. He was looking for a victim with enough intelligence to be trained, but not enough willpower to resist. He was hunting for the perfect canvas upon which to paint his masterpiece of madness. The search was managed by Nero's fixer, a freedman named Tigellinus, a man known for accomplishing the impossible, no matter how immoral. He activated the empire's vast surveillance network. Tax collectors, military officers, and local informants in every province from Egypt to Spain were put on alert. Financial reward were offered, creating a perverse incentive for officials to scrutinize the children in their jurisdictions. Imagine the scene, repeated in towns across the empire. An imperial agent, cloaked in the authority of Rome, arrives and demands to see the children. A young boy is brought forward, while his parents look on with a mixture of terror and hope. The agent produces a small portrait of the dead empress, holding it up to the boy's face, measuring his features with a cold, calculating gaze. Thousands of young people were identified as potential matches. Imagine the terror. Imperial agents arriving unannounced at your home, your school, your workshop, to measure and evaluate your child like livestock. The families, of course. They were informed that the emperor was seeking promising young pages for the imperial household, a position of great honor and opportunity. Blinded by the prospect of a better future for, eagerly competed to have their child chosen, unknowingly leading them to slaughter. The final selection came down to 3 candidates, brought to Rome for Nero's personal evaluation. He observed them for weeks, testing their resemblance to Poppaea not just in looks, but in gesture, movement, and presence. The winner of this grotesque contest was a boy from a well-to-do family in Asia Minor. His name is lost to history. We know him only as Sporus. He possessed, in Nero's eyes, the perfect storm of physical similarity and psychological vulnerability. He was shy, soft-spoken, and desperate for approval. And in the days before the procedure, locked away in luxurious palace quarters, he spoke to servants about the honor of serving the emperor, about making his family proud. He was kept in a carefully constructed bubble of deception, a lamb being groomed for a sacrifice he could not comprehend. The night before the transformation, he fell asleep in a bed of silken down, completely unaware that he would awaken in a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The nightmare began with the sound of sharpening knives in the pre-dawn darkness. The forging of an empress. What was done to Sporus in the palace's medical wing represents one of the most brutal acts of surgical mutilation in recorded history. The lead physician was Andromachus the Elder, Nero's personal doctor and one of the most skilled surgeons in the Roman world. This is a crucial detail. This horror was not the work of a back-alley butcher. It was performed by a brilliant, educated professional who chose to use his healing skills to destroy. To understand what Sporus endured, you must understand ancient castration. It was not a simple operation. It was a multi-stage procedure with a mortality rate of nearly 50%. Roman techniques involved total emasculation, the complete removal of all male genitalia. The goal was not just to sterilize, but to reshape the body, to create a feminine appearance. The surgery would have taken hours. Sporus would have been given a cocktail of strong wine, opium, and mandragora, a potent concoction that would have dulled the senses but done little to stop the agony. He would have been held down by assistants throughout the ordeal. The horror went further. According to surviving medical records, Andromachus performed additional procedures. He operated on Sporus's larynx, making an incision in the neck to manually adjust the vocal cords to raise the pitch of his voice. This was an incredibly dangerous procedure, often resulting in permanent muteness or death from infection. That Sporus survived it all is a medical miracle. The recovery was a months-long agony. Sporus had to lie completely immobilized for weeks to prevent the wounds from reopening. The risk of infection was immense. He was kept in total isolation, attended only by a handful of sworn-to-secrecy physicians and servants. The psychological trauma is unimaginable. Waking from surgery to find your body fundamentally and irrevocably altered, the constant pain, the isolation, the dawning realization that your old life has been utterly erased. Devastating truth was revealed when Sporus was finally strong enough to walk. A physician held up a polished bronze mirror. The reflection was that of a stranger, a pale, scarred version of a woman. Palace servants described the sound that emerged from Sporus's throat not as a scream or a sob, but as something entirely new, an expression of grief so profound it seemed to come from a previously undiscovered depth of human suffering. Once the physical wounds began to heal, the psychological reconstruction began. This was a process even more insidious than the surgery. Nero assigned a woman named Lusta, an imperial tutor who specialized in training aristocratic girls for marriage. Her task was to systematically erase what was left of Sporus's original personality and replace it with a perfect imitation of the techniques she used are hauntingly familiar to modern students of brainwashing and cult programming. The process began with sensory immersion. Sporus was confined to rooms that were exact replicas of Poppaea's former chambers. The same furniture, the same colors, the same incense. Every meal was what Poppaea would have eaten, served on her plates. The goal was to overwhelm his senses with her presence until his own memories felt distant and alien. Then came the memory implantation. Lusta would spend hours telling Sporus stories about Poppaea's life, but she would tell them in the second person. Poppaea went to the gardens as a child, but you remember the gardens, don't you? You remember the scent of the roses, the way the sunlight fell on your face. She repeated these stories endlessly, exploiting a known weakness in human memory, our inability to distinguish between real and vividly imagined experiences. She was installing a false past. The physical training was just as invasive. Sporus had to learn to walk, sit, and gesture exactly like Poppaea. Servants who had known the empress were brought in to critique and correct every movement. Whenever Sporus showed a flicker of his old self, an authentic gesture, a natural emotional response, not with physical brutality, but with the subtle, brilliant cruelty of sensory deprivation and social isolation. Lusta gradually convinced him that his original identity was shameful and inferior, and that becoming Poppaea was an honor and elevation. A surviving letter shows the terrifying success of this method. Sporus wrote to his family, in Poppaea's distinct style, telling them he was happy and that they should not try to see him. After nearly a year, the transformation was complete. Sporus had been so thoroughly conditioned that he could perform the role of Poppaea flawlessly, even under extreme stress. For the final public spectacle. In 67 AD, Emperor Nero married Sporus in a public ceremony of staggering expense and surreal pageantry. He insisted every detail replicate his original wedding to Poppaea. Seeing Sporus from a distance, were overcome with shock, believing they were witnessing a divine miracle. Poppaea returned from the dead. Nero was in a state of euphoric delirium. constantly referring to Sporus as his beloved Poppaea. He had remade reality. It was the ultimate psychological cage. They were now the Empress of Rome, one of the most powerful people in the world, but this power was a trap. As long as they maintained performance, they lived in unimaginable luxury. The moment their authentic self broke through, they would lose everything. They had been given the world at the cost of their soul. The year of 4 emperors. Life as the Empress Poppaea was a daily performance on a knife's edge. Sporus was surrounded by luxury, from the food they ate to the clothes they wore, was dictated by the preferences. They had to attend official functions, meet dignitaries, and offer opinions on matters of state, all channeled through persona of Poppaea. Imagine the terror of sitting in council, ask for your thoughts on a grain shortage in Egypt, and having to dredge up some implanted memory of what Poppaea might have thought, knowing a wrong word could unravel everything. They were a ghost inhabiting their own body. The constant pressure led to severe anxiety, insomnia, and what palace physicians called episodes of confusion, where Sporus would momentarily forget which identity they were supposed to be performing. While Nero was lost in his domestic fantasy, the Roman Empire was crumbling. His neglect of state affairs and his astronomical spending on personal projects, chief among them the maintenance of Sporus's false life, bankrupted the treasury and paralyzed the government. In 68 AD, the provinces began to revolt. Vindex rose up, followed by Galba in Spain. The legions, the foundation of imperial power, were turning against their emperor, smelling blood in the water, took the unprecedented step of declaring the living emperor a public enemy. Nero's world collapsed overnight. His final hours were a pathetic spectacle of denial and terror. He fled Rome in disguise, accompanied only by Sporus and a few loyal freedmen. As rebel soldiers closed in on their shabby hideout, faced with a murder-suicide pact proposed by a desperate Nero, for the first time in years, not in Poppaea's trained melodic voice, but in their own, authentic sound shattered the illusion. Nero, shocked into a moment of clarity, looked at the person he had created and reportedly whispered, "One artist dies with me," before taking his own life. But Nero's death was not the end of the nightmare. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. Sporus was now a living, breathing, and deeply inconvenient piece of evidence of the dead tyrant's crimes. This ushered in the infamous year of the 4 emperors, and for Sporus, it was a terrifying carousel of new masters, each more dangerous than the last. The first was Galba, old-fashioned general. He had no idea what to do with Sporus. He saw them as a political problem and placed them under house arrest. Free from Nero's direct control, began to fragment, suffering from what we would now call dissociative identity disorder, sometimes responding as Sporus, sometimes as Poppaea, sometimes as no one at all. Galba's reign was short. He was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, and the throne was seized by Otho. This was a cruel twist of fate. Otho had been Poppaea Sabina's original lover, the man Nero had exiled to steal her away. When Otho looked at Sporus, he saw a ghost. He was fully aware Sporus was a surgically altered boy. His treatment was a new kind of psychological torture. He would speak to Sporus as a victim one moment, sympathizing with their ordeal, and as his beloved Poppaea the next, reminiscing about their shared past. He forced Sporus to perform reenactment sessions, acting out scenes from his long-lost relationship. Imagine being forced to wear a specific gown and recite lines from a decade-old argument you never had, with your tormentor coaching you on the correct tone of voice Poppaea had used. Sporus was being used as a human prop in another man's therapy, forced to be 2 people at once. Otho's reign also ended in suicide after military defeat. The 3rd emperor to claim the throne in that bloody year, Sporus' suffering reached its nadir. Vitellius was a man of profound and creative cruelty. He saw Sporus not as a person, but as a fascinating artifact, a tool for public entertainment. He forced Sporus to go on stage in the theaters of Rome and reenact their own trauma for cheering crowds. The stage would be set to look like a palace room or a medical chamber. Actors would play Nero and the physicians, while Sporus, the actual victim, was forced to play themselves. They had to act out their castration, their psychological conditioning, and their forced marriage. Far from being horrified, they paid exorbitant prices to watch a human being's soul be flayed for their amusement, into highest drama and feigned pain. Sporus wrote to Vitellius, begging for the mercy of death. Vitellius refused. A dead victim was no good for entertainment. I choose to die as myself. As 69 AD drew to a close, a 4th army was at the gates of Rome, led by the pragmatic general who would finally end the chaos. The cruel Emperor Vitellius realizing his reign was over, made one last pathetic gamble. He offered to hand over Sporus to the approaching army as a bargaining chip. He was willing to trade them away like a piece of property to save his own skin. Something inside Sporus finally broke free. For 3 years, they had been a puppet, an object, a reflection of other men's desires and delusions. But upon learning they were to be traded once more, they made a choice. For the first time since they were a child, they took control of their own destiny. On the night before Vespasian's forces entered the city, Sporus arranged a private meeting with Vitellius, luring him with a false promise of hidden treasure. A desperate gambit that got them alone with the emperor who had tormented them for months. What occurred in that private chamber represents one of the most psychologically complex moments in all of Roman history. When the guards burst into the room, they found the emperor bleeding on the floor. Sporus had not killed him. In an act of breathtakingly symbolic revenge, they had inflicted a single, precise wound. They had severed the finger that Vitellius had used to point and jeer at them during their public humiliations. It was a final, defiant statement. You will not point at me again. This act of defiance was the first step. The final step came that night, in the quiet of a prison cell. A trial had been set, a legal spectacle that would have debated the unanswerable questions of their identity and culpability. Sporus decided not to attend. Using a shard of broken pottery from a water jug, they took their own life. They left behind a short note, scrawled in a shaky hand, their own handwriting, not the elegant script of the emperor's Poppaea. It contained just a few words, a final, triumphant declaration that echoes through the ages. I choose to die as myself. After 3 years of being surgically altered, psychologically remolded, and systematically dehumanized, Sporus reclaimed their identity in the only way left of them. They refused to let their story be defined entirely by their tormentors. They wrote the final chapter themselves. The story of Sporus is one of almost unbearable cruelty, a testament to the depths of human depravity when power goes unchecked. But it is also, in its final, tragic act, one of the most powerful stories of human resilience ever told. It is a reminder that the core of who we are, our authentic self, can be buried, tortured, and brutalized, but it can never be completely extinguished. The human spirit's need for dignity and self-determination is a force so fundamental that, when all other avenues are closed, it will find its voice in the ultimate act of freedom. If this journey into the shadows of the human heart has held you, if you believe these forgotten stories deserve a voice in the light, then join our circle of history's explorers. Let the like button be a flare against the darkness of the past, and subscribe to ensure you never miss another descent into the stories that made us who we are. In the comments below, I want to know what part of this story will stay with you tonight. I read every single one, because it is in our shared reflection that these lost souls are truly remembered. Sleep well, and remember the strength that lies, unconquerable, within us all.